Okay, it is 11:30, and it's time to open our small group C. So welcome, all of you. We will have 3 contributions, and we will proceed in alphabetic order. So Ondřej Fischer will begin, then Martina Kopecká will follow, and finally Lamser. All right. So I will stop sharing this program. Welcome, Michael.
Hello.
Begin. Hello.
Good to see you all.
Good to see you. So we will open our session. It's the first contribution which will give us Ondřej Fischer. Ondřej teaches ethics at Jabok Institute of Social Pedagogy and Theology, and also at Protestant Theological Faculty of Charles University. His doctoral research focused on professional ethics and also virtue ethics. And today, Ondřej will talk about Benedict's concept of attentive heart in his Deus Caritas Est encyclical, seen in the light of Francis Laudato Si, and also the needs of Christian professional social practice. So, Ondřej, please share your ideas and your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. I hope you hear me all well. And if you allow me, I would give particular welcome and greetings to Michael. Good to see you, Michael.
Good to see you, Ondřej.
And I hope this won't be that big waste of your time. And I appreciate.
I will learn a lot. I know I will.
Good to see you.
Looking forward to see you.
Thank you. Back to the topic of mine. I decided to use the challenge of the meeting, namely the conception, the various concepts of heart, in the attempt to see what message we can learn about the attitude we may have to professional Christian social action. And 2 options were at hand in my view, namely the encyclical letter of Benedict, Deus Caritas Est, and then subsequently Francis's Laudato Si. Before I get to that, I will make an attempt to share few notes on this, and then I will start. Here we go. Good. Okay. So, yeah, is that, can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, not. And once again. Okay. Apologies for. Okay, here we go. So, why to put these 2 encyclical letters together? When relating them to the word, the way how they use the word heart, and in particular how this way of using the word heart could have an impact on what we mean by professionalism. It is not in that sense that these encyclicals deal with professionalism, which particularly may not be true about if it comes to the encyclical Laudato Si, whereas the encyclical Deus Caritas Est has some parts devoted to talking to Christian social welfare workers in organizations such as Caritas diaconia, and others. I will start with, I will start with a brief introduction how this concept of professionalism gets into those encyclicals, and then I will say a few words about each of them, and finally I will try to make more explicit the link how the words heart and the way how are these were being used by Benedict and Francis, how they can enrich the concept of professionalism. I will start with the concept of heart in a broader sense, rather than to focus only on the Benedict's attentive heart, which is a specific expression, one of the few Benedict really uses. But the heart will be seen as rather a hermeneutical tool when looking at the agenda of the encyclical letter. Agenda which will then lead me to understanding how possibly one could develop a proper ideal attitude to professional action. By professional, here I will mean especially when related to helping profession, like being engaged in social welfare. We may obviously have some difficulties with this approach because how this could get into the link of professionalism. But perhaps it would be worth mentioning that professionalism can be understood as clearly as ethical term. It is a term which denotes a certain trait of character of a worker, which obviously involves some technical or formal education, but not only that. It is a word which has a strong ethical connotation. If I suggest to say that someone is unprofessional, that means clearly that someone is in some respects bad. So this ethical aspect of professionalism justifies me to use the link of the way how Benedict and Francis speak of some ideal attitude to life using the word heart and the concept of professionalism. One of the difficulties is that Pope Benedict in his encyclical focuses on mainly on God's loving act to us as a response to God and to God and to the less advantaged, which we want to which we want to transform God's loving act. This the letter is more concerned about the practical implication of the, we can say, dogma of God's loving act to us. Whereas Pope Francis, in his encyclical letter, speaks of, let's say, the first things like of our land, our earth as sister or mother earth, inspired by Saint Francis of Assisi. So there could be quite different initial distinctions, but at the end we may see that they may come together. For the purpose of the argument, I will start first with few hints about the way how Benedict uses the concept of heart. Benedict starts with acknowledging that there are very different conceptions or ways how we use the concept of heart, and that we have very different forms of love to which the word heart he refers. And the concept of love would include, interestingly, in the love for the country, or love for one's profession, or love for one's friends. And only at the end he mentions also love between man and woman. But in the first part of the encyclical, Benedict goes into the, I would say, into pains to explain how we should understand the love using this Plato's concepts of eros and agape. And it is interesting that God's love to us is that which really unites both the eros as the affective, acting, striving aspect of love, and the agape as the social, sharing aspect of love. Whereas in his view, we are not, as people, we are not fully able to expose or to live the agape and eros in the neutral balance. So that could give some troubles to those who would see that agape should be the starting point for our action towards those who need us, to the needy, because as if it was not the complete starting, the complete, let's say, starting point for the action to the others. And this is quite important to understand that when Benedict speaks of actual activity to those who are needy, he uses as a ground for it the understanding or the realization of our faith that God is the first who loves us. Our love to the others comes from our understanding of love from God to us. So in this aspect, it is important to see that Benedict speaks as if of a command to love the others in a social action, for instance, on the basis of the parable of Good Samaritan, which is a parable which helps us or gives us some anthropological assumption that, namely the fact that the command of love of neighbor is inscribed by the Creator in a man's very nature. So we may see that the action towards the others, the social action, has its resource in a command to love, no matter how well realized on the basis of our faith that God's love to us was the first one. And this is the starting point from where Benedict approaches, let's say, that what we could use for understanding of professionalism. In his 31st paragraph, he mentions that those charitable organizations must be somehow different than the other organizations. They have to dedicate themselves to others, and now it comes with heartfelt concern, enabling them to experience the richness of their humanity. And I continue, consequently, in addition to the necessary professional training, these charity workers need a formation of the heart. They need to be led to that encounter with God in Christ, which awakens their love and opens their spirits to others. What I want to explain on this particular quotation, which really was the spark for this topic of juxtaposing Benedict and Francis, is that no matter how to what pains Benedict goes to show that this Christian social service is a service of humanity and of something that arises spontaneously from one's faith setup, this heartfelt concern, this special attitude of concern to others is something what comes as something another, as something on top what is or obviously expected from other, as it were, professionals. So it seems that this special Christian ethos of social service is something what comes on top of what is normally expected social services do, to put it into practical terms. And we can obviously find many reasons for seeing behind this well-meant, I believe, attitude or understanding of what it means to be professional, as explaining that we really love the other for the humanity of the other. But this is something which must come from, as it were, our faith and a response to God, realizing of God's love to us. This could be a problem in the light of, let's say, more, I would say, today acceptable concept of professionalism, and I mentioned it here just now, namely that this is the quotation of the Attentive Heart, something which comes kind of as an extra addition to our training. The concept of professionalism usually wants to take a worker as a unity, as someone who is holistically accepted, someone whose education contains also some formation of heart and not something extra. When we look at Benedict, at Francis' way of using the concept of heart, it is quite different, because Francis starts his encyclical with gratitude and with praising the earth and the whole, let's say, ecological environment. And we may see that he emphasizes, we could say, the word heart is used to speak of a place where God's grace resides, where we are free, where we are able to share in a communion whatever we have. So the starting point, we would, or center point of Benedict's understanding of life and world is that it is a place which we are invited to share with others. We may find the initial, let's say, the initial concept or initial word in our open-heartedness, which is something that plays crucial role in also the social aspect of Francis's encyclical. The encyclical is somehow geared towards more ecological understanding on the one hand, but on the other hand, the ecology can be realized only when we accept or take some fundamental openness, when our hearts are self-giving, where this integral ecology goes beyond language, beyond something that we can explain, to the very heart of what is human. So it looks as if the social action which Benedict clearly or explicitly mentions as the key point of the encyclical, no matter how ecological it is. The social action starts not from realizing any command of God, not from realizing that we need to learn something extra, but from certain position of our concern, that our heart are ready to accept, to care, to be attentive. And we may even see that the attentiveness of heart or the concern of heart is that important that if we wouldn't have that, it would be as if we were violating the rest of the creation. When we are speaking of an attitude of the heart, one which approaches life with serene attentiveness, which is capable of being fully present to someone without thinking of what comes next, which accepts each moment as a gift from God to be lived to the full. That's a quote from one of the last paragraphs of the encyclical Laudato Si. So we find that this Francis's concept of the heart starts with the requirement of being able to see, to notice, a requirement which also we should grant to Benedict's treatment of our relationship to other and the role of others and the role of heart. But we may say that Benedict somehow stopped with the request that through our heart we should see more attentively and more finely on the basis of our requirement to fulfill the commandment of God, to love. Whereas for Francis, the heart that sees is the starting point, and it is a heart which is somehow open to fraternal relationships and to wholehearted concern. And in this wholehearted concern, it becomes the service of humanity. To conclude how this links to professionalism, or how could these two, and especially the Benedict's attitude, inform the professionalism, I will just mention 3 points which seem to be important for professionalism. And one of them I would take from Derrida's confession of what it means to be a professor, meaning what it means to act as a professional. Professional is someone who declares for that what one really believes, that what one is ready to put stake on, which it is a feature which somehow asks for unity and not for schizophrenia, like I will be doing one thing and thinking of it another thing. So this feature clearly is better dealt with or better understood when we read Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. Another interesting aspect of professionalism in the deeper sense is the request of engagement. The word which comes through Laudato Si, that we have to be engaged, we have to be attentive. And this is something what, for instance, Australian philosopher nicely explains as let's say, ability to engage in an appropriate way with certain values. So there is a good way towards meeting this challenge of this deeper professionalism, especially in Laudato Si. And finally, I could get back to Plato and his concept of justice, because it seems that what finally Francis in his encyclical does is that he tends to educate his readers to open their hearts and see how things really are, or how they should be, what are their places in the universe. And when we look at Plato's concept of justice, it seems to me, just that. Namely, justice is that what allows us to have things as they should be, where they should be. So this is my last point, that even though Benedict strongly supports humanity as a resource for Christian social action in a professional way, far more open and less, let's say, requiring high theology is Benedict's attitude, who emphasizes especially our sensitivity for understanding where we are, who we are, and with whom we are, and asking us to take this into an account. And as long as we do this, we are meeting the requirements of what it means to be a professional in the most, let's say, sophisticated sense. Thank you. That's all. Sorry for the delay.
Thank you very much, Ondřej, for your paper. Excellent. And now we do not have much time, but still we have a couple of minutes for one or two short observations, comments, or questions towards Ondřej. So please, any one of you who are with us, you may raise your voice now. Yes, please unmute your mic.
Did I get it properly in your presentation that in a way being a professional means being consistent, and this is not that far from an intuitive understanding of what we may mean by the concept of heart, that it comes somehow from within and represents our really full-fledged inner being. So may this mean really some sort of bridging the two concepts that are otherwise, as you have quite meticulously demonstrated, otherwise difficult to reconcile?
Yes, sorry, I am not sure whether I got the question clearly enough, but I will try to respond. If I go astray, please do let me know. But you really hit the nail on its head by quoting as one of the, say, typical requirements of a professional, some sort of identity with itself or with himself, herself. Simply that popular or still very well known concept of professionalism deals with it in a similar way as perhaps less happily Benedict did, that the professionalism means to acquire the skills, the technical knowledge, the formal education. And then now, if you want to be a Christian, a good professional in social services within Christian context, dealing with people in their holistic attitude, you need to get something done on top of that, namely form your heart. Benedict, I think, by the formation of heart really means in one way or another to educate the workers into the mysteries of God's revelation to us. I can't understand it in other way. And I think there could be a problem, even though there are many ways how one can work on this task and sensibly enough. It is still very different approach to the one which Benedict takes. Namely, there is the fundamental assumption. You as a human person should be able to realize that you live within an environment to which you could respond fraternally, actively, attentively. If we don't accept that, I think we don't get anywhere, but we wouldn't get anywhere on Deus Caritas Est either. But as long as this is accepted, then there is a floor for many other, let's say, people of different faiths who could, realizing this and taking it in integrity, could perform their work as a service to the universe, if I put it like that. Is that somehow?
Well, thank you. It has been extremely helpful. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Martina also has.
Just very short comment. Maybe you know the exhortation Christus Vivit by Pope Francis and 2018 Bishops' Synod in Vatican. And he also is dealing with professionals, young professionals, because this is an exhortation from the Synod that was dealing with the young topics. And Pope Francis is inviting young people to become professionals, and he explains what does it mean to be a young professional, to bring, I don't know if fresh, but a new positions, new point of view, etc. So it reminds me just this thing, and maybe in Fratelli Tutti there is also something about heart and tenderness, and Pope Francis has the almost the same point of view in these topics. But thank you very much. It was
thank you. I happily acknowledge that I didn't come across this particular document in a search for this topic. And I would be delighted to get to it as soon as I can, on the one hand. On the other hand, I do acknowledge that this very human and I would say enlightening attitude to service in general, or to one's relationship to others and to the world, comes up in many other documents. Francis's speech to the Caritas workers, for instance. So absolutely agree, and thank you for the reference. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah,
just very, very quick couple of responses. First of all, Ondřej, thank you very much. Very stimulating paper and very interesting. First quick point. First, it's an interesting terminological issue that arises in English, that the counterpart of professional is amateur.
Yes.
Somebody's not a professional, is an amateur. And the amateur is the one who loves, who does this out of love. So it's interesting that there is a terminological distinction there, which you have to wrestle with even before you talk about the role of love in being a professional. The main point I want to kind of just throw in, and this is probably one of my interests, I'm not quite sure where it coheres with yours, but having taught courses on ministry in the last few years, I'm very conscious of the increased importance of accountability as a definition or a kind of criterion of professionalism. The fact that there are external bodies, even to the church, that can say, you can do this, you can't do this. And this is obviously in the light of the whole safeguarding issues for the church and so on. And how that changes our theology of ministry and therefore of Christian service. I think it's very interesting to see how our, it's not just God who tells me I have a vocation to be a priest, but the statutory services, the police have a say in this, and so on and so on. So our theology of ministry has become more complicated as a result. But the definition of the criterion for me seems to be accountability, that I'm not just accountable to God for the service that I do, but there are professional bodies and so on. And how do we theologize about that is the question. And that may have nothing to do with what you're talking about, but it seems to me there's a kind of convergence there.
Well, it is surely the first point, thanks for that, and the other one as well, both good, but I just want to mention that to the problem of accountability in this kind of deeper or more sophisticated concept of professionalism is a problem, but there is a response to it, no matter how inadequate it could be, that we employ firstly this virtue approach or this communitarian approach. Either we put trust into the person, not blindly, but after sufficient scrutinies, and we can take the word of that person as let's say, more important, or we can, as you mentioned, bring in the, let's say, communitarian aspect of responsibility. But how to theologize on that, that's a really question which I would be very interested in, how we could theologically this unwrap. That's probably what you mentioned. Is that so?
I think it's a big challenge for us to do that. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
Just raising more work there. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for questions. And I'm very sorry, but we have to interrupt this promising discussion here because we still have 2 other presentations. So thank you, Ondřej, once again. And please, let's go on to our second presenter. And it will be Martina Kopecká. She ministers a Christian community at St. Nicholas Church at the Old Town Square in Prague. She is also engaged in World Council of Churches, various bodies, as I understand it. And her paper today is called Celebrating of Easter 2020 and Liturgical Life in Churches During Quarantine in Connection with COVID-19. Please, Martina.
So my speech is dealing with the topic of celebrating of Easter in 2020. Thank you very much. Let me briefly make a short overview of my text. In the second week of Lent, we were hit by an emergency measure to fight the spreading coronavirus infection. Churches were closed all at once, and churches responded very quickly to the situation by launching online and radio broadcasted services. New programs were launched, and many preachers were offered their spiritual speeches and biblical lessons online. The Bible in many translations has been read online. Various lay groups began to engage in regular evening prayers with intercessions. Churches also offered a crisis pastoral telephonic intervention. And for example, a Mass of Pope Francis has been broadcasted from his private chapel in the house of Santa Marta and from the other places in Vatican on daily basis. I would like to answer these questions. How did the churches cope with the sudden situation? And how did the varied offer of worships and spiritual speeches originate across the churches? How did the World Council of Churches in Geneva and the European Conference of Churches in Brussels and our Ecumenical Council of Czech Republic reacted? What ecumenical and voluntary activities were initiated? How we can deal with real presence and virtual reality within the worship. Easter 2020 has become a unique experience for many Christians, and it is a question of whether the situation and online celebrations lead us to deepening of our spiritual experience, or on the contrary, it is a source of some spiritual frustration. Church acting internationally. Before we focus on what opportunities to participate in the life of church were and are available in our country, let's look what was happening abroad. In the field of ecumenism, the World Council of Churches and the European Conference of Churches were ready from the very beginning to listen to member churches and react by providing a platform for a dialogue and support. We had many calls about that, and we really try to react and provide also IT support for many churches, so they are ready to broadcast their sermons and to be connected with their parishioners. The Pontifical Council for Christian Unity has published an invitation from Pope Francis, who called all churches around the world to join online within the Father's Prayer on March 25 at noon to pray together for the early end of the pandemic. The Commission of the Episcopal Conferences of European Union, COMECE, and the Council of the Episcopal Conferences of Europe, CCEE, invited to spread the message of hope and light candles on the Easter Saturday vigils. In our country, this call for common action resonated through the Czech Bishops' Conference and the Ecumenical Council of Churches in Czech Republic very much. Among other things, for example, the Anglican Church provided a complete guide through this period on website. A list of online initiatives, links to worship services, spiritual texts, sermons, and ideas for families were available. Similarly, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Germany, EKD, accompanied their believers during Easter online, and many churches prepared an alternative program for celebrating Easter at home. The Roman Catholic Church has prepared a daily live broadcast of the Holy Mass led by Pope Francis from the chapel in the House of Santa Marta, broadcast from Wednesday's general audiences without any people, which took place on Peter's Square, as well as the blessing of Urbi et Orbi on March 15, and other special Holy Week services available on Facebook and YouTube. Thousands and thousands of people were looking and listening that. The commissions of the Episcopal Conferences of the European Union has launched the online portal sanctuarystreaming.eu. This platform offers and still offering live broadcasts from Catholic pilgrimage sites and churches in Europe. So far, it is possible to watch services from 28 churches in 17 European countries and the Vatican. The Czech Republic is presented by two places. It is Church of Svatý Tomáš in Brno and Basilica of the Visitation of Virgin Mary on Svatý Kopeček close to Olomouc. Number of innovative projects have been created and offered an alternative spiritual experience of Easter this year. With online Easter program, many churches began to accept the situation as a challenge to create new opportunities and mission to reach out to people who had not yet gone to church. As an example, let us mention the online platform gracepointonline.org, which is set up by Southern Baptist Convention and provides very, very attractive web presentation. There are biblical texts, sermons, and also so-called virtual passion experience. I have tried that, and it is half-hour program focused on self-reflection of the Easter story, and it acquaints him with the basic facts about Easter, about the life of Jesus, about the gospel, about contemporary realities and basics of theology. For the beginners and people who have no experience with the church and with the Bible, it is very, very good example how we can provide materials and how to invite people to join us. Another example is a ritual choir of several hundred people who sing Handel's Hallelujah from the Messiah Oratorio. With the help of IT technologies and the work with digital tracks, it was possible to combine all their voices into one record, and many other creative examples occurred on internet and new medias. Finding new ways. Closed churches and quarantine in many countries have shifted church activities into a world of online platforms, television and radio, which has its specific advantages. They are relatively easily accessible. People can watch TV or connect to computer on the internet, but at the same time, it has also its vivid and visible disadvantages, and it cannot replace interpersonal contact, and it is impossible to share, for example, the Lord's Supper. Reverend Robert Mickens, American Vaticanist, say in the article published on the La Croix that the priests who had previously rejected technologies began to organize mass and worship services very quickly, without thinking whether we should realize anything new about ourselves in this specific situation. The restrictions, which we did not choose, but they occurred, was an opportunity for the necessary reflection. But instead of thinking and meditating on the situation and Easter itself, the spiritual life quickly moved into virtual space, and the priest gave instructions on how to live spiritually online. As part of online broadcast, there was also an adoration, and people were invited to kneel in front of the screens, and there were many acts that we cannot go through. For example, when there is an aroma of incense, we cannot smell it, we can just see it. The Roman Catholic Church believes that in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, where he is present in bread and wine, and at the same time, the Church teaches the presence of Christ in the Word, as the Scripture says, and in the congregation of believers who meet in prayer. In a text about the real presence and the virtual liturgy, Reverend Felix Just describes the practice of the Church of St. Ignatius in San Francisco, where believers are informed about services by message or video notifications, and the clergy also use the water sprinkling and incense during the online worships. It is a question whether this helps to deepen the spiritual experience or participation or not. It is a question how to consider these aspects compared to the models of real presence, and as the Constitution Sancto Sanctum Concilium describes it, and which presuppose the physical participations of believers in worship, prayers, singing together, and sharing the sacraments and listening to the word. This presence is therefore real only in the place of the Mass, and this event is transmitted through the image among the spectators who are not present in the church. But this transmission of reality to the spectators has a real effect. An interesting aspect of the screens is, for example, during the general audience, when we also look at the present Pope rather on the screen, because we can see him better thanks to the transmission. Although we hear his real voice in a real time, but it goes through audio and amplifiers. So we also do not hear and see the Pope as a priest in the church, but we see his image and hear the reproduced voice. Mickens describes the effort to keep the services running during Easter, and perhaps to add some more to turn the church into a cyber church. It also touches the topic of criticism of supremacy of clergy and church. Each of believers has probably already heard in the sermon that being is more important than having and doing. But it is this idea that Mickens says is a stubborn effect not to stop the worship life at any cost, especially at that time. The real presence is not necessarily the same as a physical presence. According to Mickens, it is quite obvious that it is not possible to physically participate in a virtual mass because some things such as kiss, handshake, or just worship require a physical presence. Several authors, such as J.P. Grayland and Felix Just on the La Croix website, have wondered whether the quality of digital presence is comparable to physical presence. The Jesuit and the director of the Jesuit Biblical Ministries, Felix Just, replies that the digital and physical presence is not exactly the same, but at the same time, we cannot think of any of them in the sense that it is or not real. We can say that he returns here to a comprehensive discussion of what it means in Roman Catholic theology to speak of real presence. From this interpretation, for example, God's word in its interpretation, prayer and singing, and even the actions of priests are well digitally transferable and do not lose their reality. The physical experience of the congregation and the reception of Eucharistic elements are more connected with the physical presence. Felix Just opposes McCann's view and points out that we are not discussing the contradiction between real presence and virtual meditative presence, but between virtual reality and physical reality, which are different, but both are realities. These realities, by their very nature, allow a real presence, albeit not a physical one. Here we'll deal with the question of whether the forms of Christ's presence in liturgical celebrations can thus be unphysically real. We cannot convey the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, its physical form, or the perception of man at communion through virtual reality. We know how to come into contact with the other kinds of Christ's presence, also through the transmission of sound or image, because they are of the different nature. It is obvious that the handshake, the embrace, and the kiss differs when it happens physically or are depicted as a symbol virtually. But this does not mean that these manifestations have no value in a virtual world. They are not entirely satisfactory, and it lacked a dimension of physical expression, but they can still be a significant expression when a physical proximity is not possible or safe. In Grayland's analysis of the virtual presence, the term almost plays an important role. In IT terminology, virtual means not having a physical existence, but giving the impression as it would be real. Real and physical foreshadows being in oneself, having its own existence, not only an imitation. For example, it is like to study in a virtual classroom and in a regular school classroom. In virtual reality, many perceptions are absent, and our attention is easier to get tired. And it's similar with a church service. We don't feel the air of the church, we don't hear the other participants, and yet we can attend the service. Digital platforms and social networks have the ambition to connect one person to another, but it can be also misused and have a negative effect when the human lives shrink into a virtual reality, including one of a new few possibilities to meet people during Sunday services. However, the discussion during Easter did not focus only on which technologies to use and how, but to continue to raise awareness that believers were not particularly immune to the virus. Orthodox theologian George Demakopoulos responded to the situation on Twitter at Easter time by rejecting the view that a believer should be automatically protected from the contagion. The disease crossed all lines and knows no difference. The claim of the Orthodox Church that those who have won through faith receive immunity from this modern plague is providing untrue. He refers to an article by Anastasius Brandon Gallagher and Richard Reno, which presents a view of the pandemic as an apocalypse associated with the Last Judgment. Theologian Roman Williams, a former Archbishop of Canterbury, considered that the COVID-19 situation teaches us about our health treatment and described our previous experience with Ebola in Congo. Before Easter, his video appeared on Facebook, where he talks about the need to provide safety first and then to ask further questions. He talks about shared responsibilities, a situation in which our own well-being is related to the well-being and safety of other people, because the virus does not perceive national borders and also thinks about practical issues in terms of income of people. And what is the situation of people in refugee camps and other socially vulnerable people? And what's time? I will check it. Yes, so let's end up with the life of parish and communities during and after the pandemic. The time of contactless faith has certainly helped us to rediscover the importance of personal spiritual life of the home church. In times of crisis, the new thing has to be learned. It is a text. It is from text by Pastor Karel Šimr from Czech Brethren Evangelical Church. And let me also to say that I will skip into volunteering, because it is at the very end of this text, which is a brief version from the text that will be published in Studie and Texty. And this volunteering is very connected with the name of our conference about heart, because many volunteers activities occurred in our country and all over the world. The activity of crisis phone lines during the pandemic increased by hundreds of persons. I was also, as a crisis interventionist, engaged in these phone lines, and it was very, very difficult to talk to people who are very desperate. And nowadays it is even worse. People have come under psychological pressure. A frequent topic was the inability to resist the increasing psychological pressure resulting from isolation, and callers also described spiritual emptiness. The situation was especially difficult in families caring for the sick and relatives with disabilities who cannot use relief services. The churches also asked clergy who have a psychological or psychotherapeutic training to join these activities and offered a list of telephone numbers. And also let me to say a point from Roman Catholic Church families in Moravia. They decided to ask parents to have a sermon, and for children they play a bibliodrama. And on a Palm Sunday, they pretended the father was a donkey and transferred children one by one as they are Jesus into Jerusalem. And the mother was a crowd waving with the palm trees and branches and this kind of stuff. So many people tried to not to be oppressed and not to be threatened, and try to live spirituality as much as it was possible. So it was really a question of our heart and our motivation, how to go through this spiritual experience, how to be invited to find a new ways and explore this specific situation. Unfortunately, there is a second much more difficult COVID wave, and we have to struggle very much. We closed the church again because it is almost impossible to serve worship for 5 or 6 people, including me. So it is very difficult for every pastor how to deal with the situation. So we are trying to be engaged on YouTube and provide online sermons and call people as much as possible. But still, it is a challenging time for all of us. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. Martino, for your lecture, for your presentation or account of this Easter, based on your experience, and not only here in the Czech Republic, but also worldwide. So we have a couple of minutes for discussion.
If there are no questions, I can provide full version of text. Or
I think we will have some questions.
Okay, sorry.
Right. Just to say thank you for the presentation. That overview is very helpful, because we're all trying to reflect upon these issues. And here in Ireland, where I am, it's been a very difficult situation. Obviously, I don't think the church has been very imaginative. So it's good to hear that there were things happening, and it's good to share that knowledge, because we still need to have that. Could you say anything about one of the big difficulties here was the inability to celebrate funerals with only maybe 5-10 people present. And I think that was one of the most painful aspects of the situation. Do you have any comments on how people were able to do that? And
Yes, according to my experience, we were able to make all funerals as usually, but it was with just a tiny group of family members and also parishioners. So we decided to divide family funeral and also a meeting for parishioners. So it was 2 short services. But I have also a message from New York where Everdit Landro, my friend, is living, and she witnessed about her colleague in the church who provided online funerals, which is, I don't know if I'm able to do that, because I really need a personal interaction during these things. And funeral and also the sacraments, it really needs encounter. It is encounter within people and also with God. And for me, it is still quite difficult, and it is a limit for me. So I'm trying to provide a counseling. I can talk to people, but I cannot imagine that I will regularly serve any sacraments via screen. Funeral is not considered to be a sacrament, so it is a different case. But I don't know, baptisms or weddings, it is almost impossible, I think. And many weddings and many baptisms were postponed, and it is quite difficult for young couples who would like to, for example, have a family, etc. So it is a sensitive question. It is very personal, and it is very touching for people who are affected.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I have a small comment. One of the questions which I dealt with in those past months was I think the absence of ecclesiology focused on families or family liturgies. It seemed to me that our ecclesiology and liturgy and sacramentology centers around parishes and assemblies, but in these times we lacked more developed kind of family liturgies. So yeah, that's one of my observations. If you have a comment to that.
Yes, many churches published online the liturgies for families, but in the Roman Catholic Church, it is quite sensitive question how to share the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, because it is connected with the priest. But in my point of view, it is quite more. It is easier for Protestant churches, for example, my church, Czechoslovak Hasa Church, to share the bread within the family when the mother is sharing or father is distributing the Lord's Supper than in the Roman Catholic Church, where the rules are much more strict. And finally, the people who have a desire to do this have no possibility to do that. But when the priest is alone in his house or in a group of priests, they can do that. They can celebrate a mass. They can do everything as they are used to. But in families, it is impossible. So it's quite sad story to listen to people who really have desire to do this in extraordinary circumstances, so they know it is not possible to do it regularly. But I think the church should discuss these questions in the spectrum of churches, and it is also ecumenical topic.
Exactly. Yeah, I think so. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Well. So, I think it's time to finish our discussion to this presentation. Thank you once again, Martina, for your account. So, our third speaker is Jan Lamser. He combines experience from business with his theological formation. And moreover, as I read, he is the president of Chess Association of the Czech Republic, which is amazing. And today, Honza will talk about Jürgen Moltmann and his quest for identity through play. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So, briefly on Moltmann and his theological considerations of play. Well, I'm not sure to which extent you're familiar with Jürgen Moltmann. He was born in 1928, and he then qualifies as an elder theologian, and his fame dates back to mid-60s, whereby he came up with repositioning of the dialectical theology, introducing to a rather statical concept of a God representing some sort of transcendent entity, a more dynamism through a concept of futurity and hope. Hope is a concept that Moltmann took from Ernst Bloch, and through what he refers to as ontology of not yet being, he believes that a theology can become more tangible and more close to the human experience. He relates hope to concepts of coming, and he believes that, well, God ultimately is something that is coming to man, and man in the inner being, or what we might refer to as a heart, ultimately projects always himself to the future with a feeling of hope. So that's a concept that was well, new in mid-60s, and it attracted quite a considerable attention. However, it also raised criticism from a number of perspectives. One perspective came from the position of man, saying, fine, man, if it's the hope that drives it, where does it come from? Well, is man always kind of skewed towards the future? So where is the reality? Where is one man's past? What is actually happening? The whole thing feels like a bit mechanical. We just project ourselves to some sort of considerations. But what about the real life around us? We tend to try to experience joy. We are surrounded by suffering. Hope is nice in here, but does it say that hope ultimately is something that is not real at all, and we should simply compensate our problems and troubles through just exporting them to the future that might ultimately ease them? Another type of criticism came from the perspective of God, saying, well, fine, that's the hope and the God is coming and that's the promise, but well, if confronted with the observations, we might come easily that somehow contradict the very belief that a man's life is simply a sequence of fulfillment of promises. It somehow feels like inconsistent. Now, Moltmann was trying to do something about these criticisms, and one of the attempts he came up was through Luther. Moltmann questions, fine, if we are critical about the hope being much too shallow to define a man, so who we are talking about, who is a man? And he's putting a distinction about the concept of man as someone who is in a way building his own identity through his beliefs in himself and through his actions, as professed by, for example, Aristotle, whereby he says man, it's merely a sequence of activities seasoned by virtues that just build someone who may assert herself or himself. Against this, Luther, which is the reference Moltmann makes, maintains that this is by no means the case. A man is primarily conditioned by a relationship not to himself or alternatively to other men, but a relationship to God. The famous hominem justificari fide. There is something more than our proximate context that we live through. Well, the true identity cannot be acquired simply through certain technical virtues that we adjust our activities against and then just build ourselves. But we must simply understand ourselves ultimately in our heart as being conditioned by the God. But this has very significant consequences that Luther specifically came up with. He contrasted the works that Aristotle believes might make a man with the fact that these works are conditioned always by what he refers to, making reference to the Bible, to the law. Luther maintains that there is no way from activity, meaning works, to being, I mean the true identity of a man, because it's always the law that conditions the virtues, the surrounding, and then hence man just becomes simply a derivative of the law, so he has no proper identity of himself. There is no freedom because, well, what he believes as a freedom is simply adjustment to the law that governs his works. Then Luther maintains man in a way becomes her or his own God, creator and producer, and that was his criticism of the medieval church. Well, Moltmann's point is that interestingly, it's Marx that Tim expanded on at length yesterday, basically takes exactly the same argument while coming up with the analysis of political economy. He extends what Luther refers to works to what he denotes as work, and uses the same type of analytical thinking to the relationship between the employer and employment and the work or the activity of a man that is being de facto sold against pecuniary compensation. Now, I will not reiterate about the whole point that Marx makes, but ultimately what matters is, and what Moltmann underscores, that similarly to the Luther, to the false identity imposed by works, basically capitalistic system in the eyes of Marx imposes the same sort of hierarchy of values that are de facto a justification by profit alone, and hence cannot bring a man a proper ontological foundation. The economical thinking that underlies the capitalistic organization of the society ultimately leads through money and the notion of profit to merely nothingness, and moreover, as we simply do not engage ourselves in the activities we ourselves believe spontaneously are relevant, but simply comply with what we are told to do against the compensation. This is a coercive design, and we are fundamentally totally unauthentic. And this simply fails to be a proper basis for man's identity. So Moltmann says, well, ultimately Marx is right, and there is a striking similarity between the reform thinking and or the thinking of the Marxist political economy. However, we might agree on the criticism of the medieval church, and we might find parallels to how the current society is organized, but well, what is the alternative? Now, what is the point he makes, inspired by Simon, the early Marx and the Marxists of the first half of the 20th century? He says, well, if we are trying to find something that is fundamentally different from work and from works, what is that? And his response is, it's play.
Sorry, we can see only the first slide of your presentation.
I see.
At least myself.
So, is this still the case?
Now, yes, good. It's moving now. Yeah.
So.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you see this kind of qualitative difference, all of you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, well, why play? Well, play is a strange thing, but we do not have place to really enough space to discuss well, the definitions and the difficulties with defining play. But well, there is some sort of consensus that play displays certain interesting features. One thing is play is closely associated or believed to be closely associated with freedom. So you cannot play unless you are free to play, because well, if you are forced to play, suddenly it's no more a play. Play is typically accompanied with a feeling of joy. So even in biblical terms, you often see a joy being expressed by notions of children playing in the streets and singing and so on and so forth. So there's a clear close connection. There is another thing that is interesting about play that is referred to as autotelicity, strange term, but well, that endeavors to express that play is something that is typically meaningful, but the meaning comes from within the play itself. So play is never externally motivated. The reason why we are playing is the fact that we enjoy playing. As someone gives us some sort of instruction to play and the reason to play, well, suddenly it becomes something different, and it might still have certain elements of play, but in proper terms, well, we are no more in a situation of playing. There is something strange about the relationship between play and time. Play, in a way, defines its own time. We can see this while playing soccer, or we can see it in chess, whereby we simply just alter moves. And it's a very different logic from what we typically experience as a time that simply is a kind of sequence of events that we have no power over. Well, play imposes on time some sort of its own rule. And another thing is quite interesting about play, that this is the only emotion that can inhibit fear. So fear is extremely powerful if you experience well, whatever pleasurable feeling and well, you're hit by a fear, well, it's always fear that just takes it all. While, well, if you're just playing, well, you might be well aware of certain risks and dangers, and even well, certain contexts that otherwise would simply inhibit your activity, but as soon as you just position yourself as a player against the same context, fear is gone. Play is stronger than fear, which is interesting. Based on this, Moltmann says, well, it's interesting. So, play is not something that is merely distraction, but it might be something taken seriously as a candidate for an identity, unlike work or works. He did it in refer to Schiller, who in early 19th century came up with elaborated theory of play, rather from the philosophical perspective than theological indeed. And inspired by Schiller, Moltmann came with some sort of concept saying, play ultimately allows us to discern what is happening around us. Play is a very basis of situating ourselves in the world, ultimately comparing things, even talking or competing are also forms of play. There is an element of creativity in play, and moreover, play also brings the capacity of dealing with each other. There is an interpersonal element in playing. Play is fairly dialogical thing. Against this wholly positive concepts of playing and their potential to serve as a foundation for an identity, Moltmann also came with a critique of play, observing that play may become a very dangerous stereotype. There are forms of play that somehow apparently lack content, that are rather imposed on the player than being genuinely authentic forms of play. And he points to the fact that play is very often associated with power, that certain forms of play serve to distract people and their free to somehow channel their freedom to forms of organized behavior that have many features of a play, but ultimately what is underlying them is a manipulation, motivation of the organizer to orient people in their thinking, in their behavior towards certain patterns. So from this perspective, play is something that is interesting, that both may ultimately bring you an ultimate level of freedom and self-assertion and identity, but at the same time it be strongly enslaving and become a very dangerous stereotype. Then bringing all these considerations together, Moltmann says, ultimately what matters in man's life is to come up with a good balance between these two reference points, the dangers of this stereotype, manipulative, enslaving play, and the capacity and the potential of a free play. This brings himself to a interesting concept of reconsidering the whole theological narrative along the notion of play. He says, well, there is something interesting about play. It's a concept that is common to God and man. The very creation that we experience and live in is an ultimate result of a divine play, and our own creativity simply is a play that we are engaged through creation with God. God's glory is in direct correspondence with the joy we are experiencing. So play is something that it just connects directly with man and God. And similarly to the God that through creation and through the divine omnipotence and presence ultimately may rule the world, as we have in fact the biblical narratives around it, namely in the Old Testament. Well, similarly, a man has been entrusted with ruling the creation in its own capacity. So there is also through play something that brings the two concepts together. And he also, based on this sort of considerations, retells the narrative of the fall. From Moltmann, creation ultimately that's a gift from the God, a gift of play that man corrupted, switching from a play that would have the features of free play as God demonstrated in creation to the stereotyped forms of play that are based on power and that are based on the law as Luther demonstrated. And this leads him to reconsidering both the real life situations we live in and the whole theology, underscoring again where we started, the notion of future and the eschatology. The eschatology for Moltmann, that's the ultimate play. That's something that is not a concept that later as things get settled and achieve certain goals that God somehow came with while creating the world. An eschatology that is distinct from what we experience and from the creation. But just now, basically, it's all the same. It's still the same play, and what we have to do, and that's in fact our role, is to break through the false plays we are engaged in to a true play that ultimately is the play with Christ and in the eschatological type of playful community. From this perspective, he says, that's the example that has been brought to us by Christ. As strange as it may sound, Christ is a true player. That's him who has been able to both keep the playful capacity of God, the ultimate creator, and keep a human perspective on the same pattern of play without losing this capacity in these stereotyped plays that otherwise man is just fatally engaged in, that are associated with law and the fall. Christ, from this perspective, is a pattern example how a true player may assert himself against depraving reality and the law and the suffering. And if a man, as Christ was, is consequential in playing, this might ultimately lead him to a cross. So that's the danger. But the resurrection demonstrates that this is there is more than this. So a conflict of a genuine player with the environment of law and the ersatz play may lead ultimately to destruction of a player, but through resurrection, through the eschatological perspective, through the ultimate play that we cannot see through the death, but that is there, we can see on the narrative of the Evangel of the Christ that ultimately play prevails. And that is the thinking that led Moltmann to considerations of playful eschatological Christology, connecting Christ and the eschatology through play, and ultimately he also connected play with the Holy Spirit through a number of specific instances, demonstrating that what we experience while playing is not dissimilar of how the role of the Holy Spirit is typically being understood. So it came up also based on this sort of theological thinking with a concept of playful Christological pneumatology. Now, this is a concept that may sound strange. However, it has certain advantages. There is a capacity, if we just accept the construct, to bridge joy and suffering. Play stands somehow in between the ethical and aesthetical, while taking play seriously as a basis, say, for an identity, it gives us the opportunity to avoid the mechanistic references that we were confronted with this morning also while being presented with the thinking of the Maxim of the Confessor. Play is something that engages, by the very notion, we can quite easily grasp the friendship, solidarity. Play, if we just engage in play with someone, ultimately it's our partner. So the domination, the alienation, can be quite easily bridged through play. And if we apply on this on playing with God, it suddenly may bring very different and low threshold perspectives to a number of topics that theologians typically wrestle with. Ultimately, Moltmann even came with the idea that theology itself is a kind of a form of play, and that theologians should theologize not really as a professional, but rather as a player. Well, I cannot say that the concept has been really powerful and successful. I believe it's interesting. Moltmann himself dropped it, and while he drafted a short monograph in 1971, he never came back to the idea. So if anyone is interested, it's out there for anyone to pursue and follow up. So that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Honzo, for your presentation and for this interesting imaginary of play and formation of identity through play, and also for its theological roots, or playing with this imaginary in connection to theology. One thing is that we are behind the scheduled time, but I think it would be pity not to have at least a couple of minutes for discussion. So please, if any one of you would like to engage in discussion, it is time to do so now.
Jan, thank you very much indeed. That was a fascinating paper. I'm very interested in this monograph. Where does it appear? Where Moltmann talks about play?
Beg your pardon?
Where can I find the text
Well,
where Moltmann talks about play?
well, the text of Moltmann is called the Ersten Freigelassenen der Schöpfung, which is German, and there are, well, you can find it in English as a theology of play, or it is the same translation, but so theology of play was issued in the United States, and the same translation was issued in the United Kingdom as theology and joy.
Theology and joy, right? Okay, that rings bells. Yeah. Just to follow up, are you aware of Hugo Rana's book on the theme called Man at Play?
I'm not sure which one.
Well, the title of the book, this is Hugo Rana, so Karl Rana's brother. He wrote a book called Man at Play. I don't know what the German title.
No, I'm not familiar with this one.
How to practice eutrapelia. And eutrapelia is the Aristotelian virtue between boorishness and frivolity. So it sounds like a similar kind of theme. The other thing that this is interesting for me is more recently, Samuel Wells has written on improvisation as a kind of theological category. The fact that God improvises, we are in a game, if you like, playing with God, but God improvises with us in a way that does not override our freedom. So that's an interesting concept there well, he gives the example, he gives the example of a little girl who's playing on the piano. There's a concert hall. The girl comes up before the concert and she starts playing on this piano. She's just messing about. And then the pianist comes up and he starts playing with her, but playing in such a way that her chords are taken up into his playing and it becomes harmonious. And it's a lovely image of how God works with us. God doesn't kick us off the stage. He allows us to play our discordant notes, but he brings it into harmony. So I don't know whether there's a kind of overlap. Samuel Wells, improvisation.
Sorry.
Well, that's quite typical about the topic that, well, if you, anytime you raise it, you immediately can find quite a number of examples whereby, well, the concept may prove instrumental, such as indeed improvisation. There are a number of books dealing with how to use play in church education, you know, so. But well, what is interesting about Moltmann, it's the overarching ambition that he, well, gives play a pivotal role in dogmatic terms, and it's quite unique. Well, there is another similar attempt from late 40s by Hugo Rana, the brother of Karl. He came up with something similar, and to my knowledge, these are, well, the only two really dogmatic contributions that probably give play this sort of well, comprehensive explanation and a significant role in the theology as such.
Yep, that's interesting. Thank you.
May I have a question? As you spoke about the Christology and play, or Christ and play, I could follow this line, but at one point you also came across at crucifixion, and there you said that Christ lost at this game, or how to say it. At this point, I struggle with this imaginary of play at the point of crucifixion. Could you try to elaborate on this a little bit more? How can we interpret crucifixion in this playing mode?
Well, Moltmann's point is indeed crucifixion is not a play. So the suffering of Christ is real, and any player simply has to expect a confrontation with the law, with the suffering, with the rule of death. But rather than trying, well, than complying with what is being imposed on us through law, well, the true player does not fear it. So he confronts the suffering, being the authentic player. And the point is that as it's demonstrated by the resurrection, well, this sort of stance pays off. So the eschatological perspective is that, well, if you just consistently are in a mood of spontaneous play and refuse to comply with all sort of virtues and rules and the performance that is being imposed on us through in economical terms, then, well, we, as Christ demonstrated, will just assert ourselves. While if we, well, failing to do this, we indeed, are in a situation of fall, and that's in fact the sin. So this is his position, and in fact, well, cross, that's indeed the ultimate sort of contrast between play and the law.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think I would need some more thinking about it. Yeah, thanks.
Well, you are not the only one who is confused, and I think that's the, although I believe this reasoning is sound, that I now sketched, well, Moltmann himself, exactly because of the confusion that accompanied all sort of debates about his book, he just dropped the whole thing, and later never came back with a notion of, well, while his theology has been clearly very strongly influenced by this thinking, he never uses the term play anymore. So he came up with the pneumatology, well, rather than play in his subsequent contributions, he rather has the Holy Spirit, and he basically saying the same thing that he was initially attributing to play. But Holy Spirit is for, well, people some sort of more understandable, because it, well, refers to things that you can imagine, while if you just talk a play that has something to do with resurrection, it well, sounds somehow counterintuitive because it has never been referred to as such.
Oh yeah, thank you. So I think we only are left 3 of us.
Yes, so thank you very much for your patience.
So no, thanks anyway, and I think it's time to close this small group. Oh, hello, Martina.
I'm back. I'm sorry, my colleague was delivering books to me, so I have to run downstairs. Sorry.
No, it's just fine. We are just closing this small group session, and because in 1.5 hours we will start another joint session, so we need some time for refreshments. So thank you again, Martina and Honzo. Thank you, Michael, for participating.
Thank you very much.
See you later.
See you later on.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.